Good morning, everyone. It looks like we have a really nice group of folks online today. What I want to discuss primarily is estimating Agile projects and some of the recent discussions that have gone on about no needing for estimates and et cetera that we're seeing a lot of in the blog. So a lot of people come to us and say, well, we're doing this thing called Agile. We're having trouble building an estimate around it. So what I want to do is try and dispel some of the myths that you don't need an estimate and also that it really isn't that difficult. We'll have to try to give you some of the foundation blocks for building an Agile estimate. So about 35 years ago, it's hard to believe it's been that long ago now, back in 1981, Dr. Bain wrote his book on software engineering economics. And essentially what he did was he gave us a formula for understanding uncertainty and how that relates to cost risk. And his cone of uncertainty is quite famous, and most of the world really gravitate towards his understanding of cost economics around software because software can be hard to do. And his cone of uncertainty gave us some structure. But then we jump on our little time machine and we go, 20 years ahead into the future. And again, it's hard to believe Agile's been around, coming up on 15 years this year. Next year, 15 years. There was a whole bunch of different disparate type development activities going on. Paired programming was really big. Lean development was coming around. And a group of folks got together and they gave it a name. They called it Agile. And essentially it was this collection of loose, iterative, customer-centric development methods. And that's kind of when the challenge of estimating Agile projects began. And people started talking about Agile estimation, et cetera. But what I'd like to do is step through this a little bit and show you how things really haven't changed as much as we think. Okay, so essentially what you need to understand that Agile is just simply a development methodology. There's been so many of them. I've lived through the waterfall, the spiral, the iterative development, the rational unified process, all these different methodologies, they come and they come and they come. And we still have to figure out ways to build cost models around the methodologies. Agile is really no different. Around the software world, the iron triangle of development really hasn't changed much. But what we've really seen from Agile is how we look at that iron triangle. We partition it up into different types of pieces now. And so with Agile, our challenge is how we're looking at that iron triangle. And sometimes that confuses us when it comes time to build an estimate. So an Agile estimate really shouldn't be any more difficult than any other estimate. It's just another methodology. So again, back in the days when we were fighting with layered virtual machines and object-oriented development and spiral models and REP, we had the same hand-wringing at that time as that we do now. But again, just like waterfall, an Agile estimate, the precision comes over time. So at the very beginning of an Agile project, we still have that maximum uncertainty that we've always had with any type of software project. Generally speaking, most organizations, the ones that the level 5s of good organizations I work with, when they're doing their initial rough order magnitude estimate, they don't even really consider yet what methodology they're going to use. They will pick the methodology that suits the problem and the complexity of what they're trying to solve. Okay, so you're still going to be creating estimates way out early when there's maximum uncertainty. And just like with waterfall and now with Agile, with the iterative development, as the evolving complexity becomes clear, you can start creating detailed estimates. Okay? So if we lay the cone of uncertainty on that, you'll see that it really isn't that much different. It's just there's a different points in time where we deliver Agile estimates. And we'll talk about that. And everyone loves Dilbert, and this is a nice little illustration of Agile in the Dilbert world. And Dilbert says, look, this new Agile thing, to deal with unpredictable events and things we cannot control in our projects. We can prioritize, reduce the scope, change requirements at any time, and increase the chances of success, the chances of success of the project. And Pointyhead says, look, this is your new project with fixed deadline, fixed scope, and fixed quality, and you can be Agile inside this triangle. And to be honest with you, this is exactly what I see when I travel all around the world doing some Agile coaching and story point counting coaching, et cetera, and estimation model building. Okay? So generally speaking, what I see as the number one cause of bad estimates for Agile projects, it's not that they can't be estimated, it's because they do them poorly. Number one is the team is really not doing an Agile project. Everyone seems to have their own flavor of hybrid Scrum or whatever it is that they want to say that they're doing. They're saying we're doing Agile, but we have our own hybrid. Okay. A lot of times that's because they already have, or they have immature processes. They don't really know what they're doing with Scrum, and they know that not really sure how to go forward. They don't even have a mentor or a Scrum master. I've seen some teams, they really don't even do any training. They buy Mike Cohen's book, which is a great book, and some of the other Agile books, and they go forward. But one of the bigger problems, though, and the reason why they have these hybrid events is because management tends to get in the way. Management wants to micromanage that burn down chart. Management wants to compare velocity across teams and use it as a productivity measure. So a lot of different ways that hybrid is being forced on people because of other outside influences. It's not because the teams themselves don't want to do a good job of doing whatever method of Agile projects that they're working on. Okay. Another little list, my laundry list of why we see bad estimates in Agile. What I see a lot of is bad story counting. For those folks that are doing story point counting or feature point counting, they do their counts and then they try to express that same count across multiple teams, or they'll go back into the archives and say, well, this was the story point count on this last piece of work we did, and they'll use that same number. It's just a bad use of story point counting. But on top of that, a lot of times they start with bad user stories. They'll be ambiguous. They're untestable. A lot of them aren't even structured very properly. Okay. Some of the other features that cause what might have been a good estimate to go wrong is when teams start combining iterations. I was working with a group in Prague about 2 years ago, and the guy came up to me and said, I need your opinion. Every time we get at the end of the sprint, the product owner says, throw this feature and this feature and this feature in there. Just add 1 more week or 2 more weeks to your sprint. I just kind of chuckled. I said, I guess you have your own hybrid Scrum that you're doing. So why would the estimate ever be right if that's what's happening in the middle of a project? Okay, that's not to say that there's not ways to manage that, but it needs to be managed and understood at the beginning when you're building your estimates. I like a good definition for done. Sometimes people are done too early, or sometimes they're never really done. And again, when you're building an estimate, there's an assumption about what's going to be defining when something is done. Okay. And lastly, the product owner or customer being non-responsive. If you don't have a good product owner or customer on board, I would almost contend that you're not really doing Agile. Okay. So are Agile estimates really different? Just a little bit. And it's not that they're different, it's just where they're delivered that's a little bit different. So if we look at the top part of the screen, we have our traditional phases of estimates. During feasibility, that's when you know the least bit about a project, and you're probably doing a high-level ROM estimate, maybe using analogies, pairwise comparison, something like that. During the concept phase, and you start to know a little bit more about what you're building. You probably have some business requirements, so now maybe your analogies can be a little bit better, or maybe you can start inferring some type of size based upon that concept documents. And then after requirements, boy, you can knock out a function point count after you finish your requirements. And then certainly after design, and then with each incremental release, you can be building estimates. So typically what we see is estimates in these phases. Most often what I see is an estimate for the feasibility, then I'll see one right after requirements and one right after design. And these are typical gateways I see, especially like in the insurance companies and the banks, and some of the mil-aero organizations are doing this as well. Okay. So if we look at these same phases of traditional phases and we drop that into Agile, well, during feasibility, nothing's any different. If you remember that picture I showed you with the ROM estimate way to the left, everything's the same. You're probably doing an analogous estimate. Okay. During the concept phase, hopefully you have a good understanding of what some of your features and user stories are going to be, however it is that you're scaling your problem. Even if these are all epics, you're starting to have a sense of how big this thing is. So that's really not any different than what we did up above traditionally with the concept estimate. Now, after requirements, well, in a real Agile environment, this phase doesn't really exist. A lot of people say, well, my user stories are really my requirements, and that may be true, but really a user story is an idea or a concept. A requirement is something that comes from that further down after you start building out your task list, et cetera. Okay. The whole idea of Agile and the manifesto was about discovery and requirements discovery. Okay. So we don't want to pin people to doing something a specific way early. That actually happens when they get into their iteration. Okay, and then after design, same thing. There really is no notion of when design is done. You're busy building the project. You're doing your coding. You're doing your testing. You're refactoring, whatever it may be. Okay, so there's no really phase for an estimate right there. But then after each release, it's another point in time, just like what we did up top with incremental deliveries. So it's really critical to have good working estimates after each of these release cycles. Okay, and we'll talk about sprint estimates in a moment. Okay. So if we want to take this back up to a higher level again, we talk about these Agile estimates and when can they be built. Let's talk a little bit more detail of what we need to know. Okay. So as I mentioned with the ROM estimate, we can see that in our cone of uncertainty and even in our iteration lifecycle, these ROM estimates are way out here to the left before we really even know anything. These are literally back of the napkin estimates on, is it something that we should even take on? Okay. So, but you still need to know how big it's going to be. And usually the only way you can do that is maybe through some analogies of similar projects you've done, or maybe you have some type of historical data that you can use. Okay? That hasn't changed. That's the same way we build estimates for every type of methodology. So I would present to you that at this point in time, it's not even an Agile estimate, it's just an estimate. You've decided to do Agile as the methodology for delivery. Okay? You still need to know who, where, how, all those things that's going to be done. So if you reread the principles of manifesto, you're going to understand that you're creating uncertainty in the estimate now. So your ROM estimate is now going to be fraught with a lot more uncertainty about some of these things. Okay? And then, as I mentioned, you don't want to necessarily expect good results at a ROM level estimate if you know you're going to be outsourcing part of this work or using distributed teams, et cetera. But you can account for that uncertainty in your ROM estimate. All right. So again, it's very similar to a traditional top-down estimate. In fact, I would recommend you even build it the same way. But from a parametric perspective, all you're going to do is be plugging in the fact that ultimately this is going to be an Agile project. And so you reap the benefits of Agile methodology and also the downside of high requirements volatility and some of those other issues. Okay. And again, when you're building a ROM estimate, the old curmudgeons never go away. They're probably there to be your expert judgment providers, and it's going to be indicative of how long the actual estimate is going to take. Now, some of the arguments around no estimate has to do with why do we even need this estimate at all? And we've worked with an organization not too long ago, and they said, we have a budget and we have things we need to get done. We don't care how long it takes. And we asked the question, well, what do you do when you run out of time? They said, well, we just keep going. We don't, we have to get the work done. And what do you do when you run out of budget? And they said, we just get more budget. It turns out this is an IR&D project where having the end item done was of highest magnitude requirement. So literally they didn't care. They were using the Agile methodology as a method of trying to do iterative development because what they were building was something really complex and actually almost in the chaos area. So they were using the methodology for that context. So they really probably didn't need an Agile estimate. They had a budget and they had a box set of time that they could work in. Okay. But let's look at the next estimate though. And this is the one that most of the Scrum teams and the Scrum masters and the product owners where they really get together and start saying, okay, what's this thing going to cost? And the other people push back saying, we don't know. We don't know how long it's going to take it, et cetera. Okay, so I call that the forecast estimate. Some people call it the backlog estimate. It comes at the point in time where you've established your backlog, however scale that may be. Again, you may have all your user stories flushed out, or that you may have big epics that you're working with. But you do have some notion of what needs to be delivered. You have an idea of what you need to do to make your customer happy. Okay, so there's some premise for that delivered functionality. The point being here is you can actually probably start to scale your problem with some type of volume of size. How big is this thing going to be? Okay. Generally speaking, at the forecast estimate, you've identified what the release cycle is. That's usually driven by your customer requirements, the product owner. And so, but then internally within your team, you start to make decisions about, well, how many iterations do we think are going to be in a delivery cycle? So how many sprints per release, et cetera? How long are our sprints going to be? I've worked with some organizations where they'll have 3 or 4 different Scrum teams. Some are working on 2 weeks sprints, some are on 4 weeks, and some are on 6 weeks. It has to do with the complexity of what they're working on. It also has to do with the delivery cycle and what can be delivered after each release or after each sprint even. Okay. The exit criteria is understood for the features, and how to handle incomplete deliveries is understood. So what are they going to do with that backlog that comes back? Do they just, does it get pushed to the next release, or In the case of my folks in Prague, do we just add an extra 2 weeks to the project? If they want to do that, I need to know that from my estimate. So we got to really understand how to build our estimate. Okay, and finally, your team should be well known at this point in time, and your customers should be fully engaged. If you're doing a real Agile project, this is exactly how you're set up. Okay, so you already know how many teams you need, how to assign that functionality, and one of the biggest things you need to negotiate at this point in time is that thrill of discovery. I worked with a team one time, and the product owner said, "Can you build this thing for us?" And we built it, and about halfway through it, he says, "Wow, I didn't know you can do that. Can you do this?" And we said, "Okay, sure." So we the next sprint, we gave him some other functionality. "Wow, I didn't know you could do that. Can you do this?" So he didn't really understand what it was he really wanted. It was a perfect Agile project, but we had to manage his discovery on what we call scope creep. Okay. The next estimate we talk about would be a working estimate or release planning estimate, and these are pretty critical for understanding, is the work that you have allocated really going to fit into this life cycle, this period of time? Okay, so again, within these bullets, what I'm describing is the environmental and technological factors that are going to affect your model or your estimate. Okay, so you've assessed your team and your customer. Is that customer proactive or distractive or hyperactive? All these things will influence how you're going to perform on the project. If you already know ahead of time what some of the issues are going to be that you're going to face during the life cycle of your development activities, you can project those into your cost estimate way up front. Okay. Again, are you really doing an Agile project or some fake hybrid Scrum? A lot of organizations with quality control, they feel kind of left out, especially in the mil-aero world. The QC guys, the quality assurance folks, they tend to feel left out, and they want to get their fingers in the pie. One of the most brilliant things I've seen done was a very large aerospace company down in Texas. What they did was they sent their quality control folks, the QA folks, to Scrum Master training. And they actually turned the QA people into Scrum Masters. It was brilliant because now you have the quality assurance folks bought into what they were trying to deliver. They were actually available to help influence the project rather than just hit their little check boxes on their sheets of paper. Okay. During release planning, you need to understand how each individual team is going to be able to deliver, because literally what you're doing is you're laying out the work that's going to go into these different releases or sprints. Okay. So as you've been tracking along, is your velocity likely to increase or decrease in the next iteration? Maybe it's going to decrease because what you're working on now is a lot more complex than what you worked on before. So many times I work with these teams, we'll have a 4-man or a 5-person Scrum team, and their velocity, they're using story points, and they say, well, our velocity is 40, and now we're going into the next release, and well, it was 40 last time, our velocity should be 40 this time. It could be, if assuming that they adjust their story point counting for the complexity of the work they're working on. So, and that's one of my problems with story points, is they tend to be hard to distribute, not just across teams, but also across different complexities of types of projects you're working on. Okay, so is one team outperforming another? You could actually learn from that before you build your estimate. And then you have to have that time to refactor the estimate. So as you're building your release estimate going forward, you get ready for the next release, you need to refactor the estimate just like you would refactor the work that's going forward, because things change. Everything that you assumed when you first started the project, you throw it out the window by the time you're on that second release. Okay? So some of the reality of estimating Agile projects, they still need to be generated for a total project. I mean, everyone still wants to know, what's this thing going to cost me way up front? Okay, so people need to set aside budgets, and there needs to be some level of assurance to management that that project is actually going to be feasible to get done. Okay, so Agile project estimation doesn't really go away. You still have that requirement. What I recommend is that you think about 2 deliverable estimates. A planning estimate, which is that high-level ROM estimate way up front, and then perhaps maybe skip the forecast planning estimate, and when you get to your first release, which is really kind of your first backlog planning session, you start building your working estimates for your iteration planning. So you start understanding what's going to fit in each of these releases. Okay. Now there's a third estimate, but I like to keep these internal to my teams, and these are my sprint planning estimates. And essentially what these are is at the beginning of each sprint, I go back and I take a look at the backlog, what we got back from the previous sprint, and what we're looking at going forward. And what I really want to make sure is if we commit to doing something this next sprint, can we get all that work in? One of the nice things about parametric models is I can actually calculate the likely number of defects that I'm going to have at the end of that sprint and understand how big my backlog is going to grow. That's usually not something most people plan when they're doing their sprint planning sessions and they're managing their burn down charts. You know, backlog or defects or unfinished work is treated like an anomaly when it's actually a big reality. Okay, and again, these are not management delivered estimates. You keep these internally. All right, so when we talk about that backlog estimate, so we built that initial full estimate. This is kind of even before the ROM, or right after the ROM. One of the problems with that big backlog and trying to create an estimate from that is all the uncertainty in there. As I mentioned, you may be working with epics, things that are just really big, and you haven't even broken down into smaller stories yet. Okay, so with all that stuff that you're doing, there's a whole bunch of known and unknown constraints that you're going to run into. You know, how good are the people going to be? Is this a brand new technology? You know, is the customer really going to be around? If you're pressing to do a time to market and you have market uncertainty, what's the impact of that going to be? This is exactly why you might want to do Agile, because Agile helps you mitigate all these types of things. Okay, but actually answering these questions are best answered using a parametric model. It's very hard to get your arms around these types of uncertainties using an Excel spreadsheet. Okay. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit about using a parametric model, specifically SEER, for building these types of estimates. Okay. So if we stop and take a look at what do parametric models provide for us. Okay. I've mentioned a few times already, the number one thing I like about them is that right away I can understand if the work I'm trying to put into a release or sprint is going to fit or not. Okay, productivity doesn't lie, and I'm not talking about velocity, which is a byproduct of how much work you got done the last time and averaged over a series of sprints. I mean, that's a velocity, and it's a good rule of thumb for how much work you should be able to get in, and it's a good starting point to see if something will fit. But within a parametric model, you just take all those stories that you counted, and you take that 40 story point block of stuff, and you put it in the model, and it says, you know, based upon this thing that we're doing now, it's a lot more complex. You probably are not going to get it all in, or you have room for more user stories in this release. Okay. It allows you to compare productivity across teams, regardless of your sizing method. So you may have one team that's doing story points, maybe another one doing feature points, another one doing ideal days, etc. When you take all that and put it into the funnel of the SEER model and you generate what we call effective effort units, everyone's equal on the playing field. So now we can understand which teams are being productive, which teams are less productive, and then we can take a look at it and say, is it because the team is less productive, or are they working on something that's more complex, etc. Okay, so from a manager's perspective, and I was a software engineering manager for a company for quite a while, it's an invaluable tool to be able to look at it and say, okay, I'm not going to punish this group just because they're doing less story points than this group, but that's what I observe when I travel to these other companies. Okay. You need to understand how many latent defects are going to be in the release or sprint. I mentioned that before, so you can actually do a backlog prediction, what's going to happen by the time you get through each sprint and onto the next release. It's nice to know what the impact of having an immature team assigned to something as opposed to a good team. It allows you to understand where you might need to move some better resources around, maybe make sure a Scrum Master pays a little more attention to this one team. Same way with visibility to offshore teams and vendor engagements. Within a parametric model, you can quickly identify what the impact of the increased lines of communication are going to be, especially as those lines of communication are even more removed from you, either geographically or organizationally. Okay. You can look at the impact of complex applications. I mentioned that before. Maybe this project, the thing you're working on is a lot more difficult. You could capture that. You can do trade-off analysis of what should be done in waterfall or maybe what should be done in Agile. The CAS Software Corporation released their crash report last September, so it's almost about a year ago now. And one of the big findings that they had was they discovered that most Agile projects on their own or most waterfall projects on their own floundered. However, those large projects that brought in a mix of Agile and Waterfall together were very successful. And if you go on their website, CAST Software, C-A-S-T, software.com, they call it the crash report, and you can take a look at that. And again, our goal with the parametric model, obviously, is you want to be capturing historical data so you can feed it back into the model. And now once you have this historical data, you can compare your expected performance to how you performed last time. So you let the math be the truth detector, and you remove the human bias of optimism, and you let the model say, no, you're not going to perform as good as you did because historically you haven't been performing that well. And it's very easy to drop these back into the model. Okay, and again, there's dozens of other project indicators you can use. My point being is that if you're not using a parametric model for this type of stuff, you're almost flying blind. I mean, people do it. Some people are very successful. I just happen to be a big fan of parametric model. Okay, so if we take like a kind of a snapshot view of what the SEER model gives you, and again, this is just very high level. There's an estimate that we built for a fraud portal. This is for an insurance company. And they had multiple releases, and they had the different teams broke up, and they had the user stories broken here. And so we look at Team A, and they were doing 4-week sprints, 1-month sprints. And if we look at it, we plugged it all in, and sure enough, the work that we had allocated wasn't going to fit into this sprint. Okay, so we saw that right away. And we also saw that we're going to have a high number of latent defects coming out of that work, because we were trying to cram a whole bunch of stuff into a release with a small team, and it caused a lot of defects to be coming out of that. So this was a great candidate to go back and revisit what it is we want to do with this this team on this sprint. Now, if we look at Team B, all their work fit in the 4-week sprint. But if we look at the volume of work being done, this team up here had effective functions of around 51 function points worth of work. Again, we had story points that were converted back into function points. And this team is doing 120 function points worth of work. So wow, this team is twice as productive as this team. What's wrong with you guys? Well, the reality is they're building something completely different. And I see the productivity is really not that much greater than this team. So what's the real answer? Is it really that much better of a team, or is the work less complex? At least now, as a project manager, I have the ability to go in and look at these things and say, okay, what do we need to do to make everyone equal? Or perhaps this is exactly the way the project is going to proceed, because that's how much time is needed just to do this work. Okay? So you now have the tools to do those decision making. Okay. So I mentioned the SEER model. It comes filled with a whole bunch of stuff already in there to support Agile projects. We have knowledge bases. There's sizing templates available. We have some example sizing templates for story points, but you can build it for feature points, ideal days, anything that you can scale. You can create a sizing template for that. We give you the ability to create custom activity and labor naming schemas, so you're not stuck with the standard SDLC of a waterfall activity. You can actually go in and look at, okay, how much time am I spending in my sprint during these different pieces of the sprint work? Okay, and then we also have the ability to preload the work that you're going to be working on. I call it user story management, but it could be requirements, it could be features, anything. You can actually preload those into the database, and then when you get ready to do your release planning or sprint planning, you go grab those things that you want to have integrated into the next release, drop them into your estimate, and see if they fit. So on that previous slide, when I said, is this going to fit, that's exactly what I did. I went and grabbed those 2 user stories, dropped them in, and said, holy mackerel, this work's not going to fit. Okay. We mentioned the knowledge bases, and again, what I want to do is bring you back to that ROM estimate we first talked about. And I said that didn't go away. You still have to build that first estimate. And you're using analogies or however it is that you're scaling the problem. But you can still go ahead and say that we know this is probably going to be done. We're going to do an Agile development on this project because it happens to be of the nature of something that is good for a Scrum project. Okay? And I'm being very specific in saying something like that. So we have a complex thing. We're going to do Scrum on this one. And another project, we have some different complexity. We might do Kanban or XP, whatever it may be. Okay, so I can now tell the model that we're going to be doing an Agile full project, and I'm not specifying what type of methodology. I'm just saying Agile here. I'm not saying Scrum or XP or Crystal methods or any of those things. I'm just saying Agile. So the model now is going to accommodate all the richness of Agile and also the nuances of high requirements volatility and some of those other issues. Okay, so you've built your estimate, and now your estimate in most cases actually comes in from what would be a typical waterfall model. Okay, the next thing you would do is go ahead and break it into releases, and I kind of illustrate that in the picture, but it's not quite clear. All right, so first thing we do is characterize our team and how we're going to do it. So within the model, it's really simple. For those of you that are already using SEER, you simply set up your environment so that it looks like an Agile project. You got to convert the workload into like some type of SEER volume measure that SEER can use. I talked about story points, feature points, all those things. All those can be converted into a SEER volume measure. And then you want to determine how you're going to build that estimate. Are you just like the traditional early estimate with analogies, or do you already have user stories, use cases, whatever it may be that you're going to drop in? And then you just simply build your estimate. It's either a top-down or you're building a bottoms-up with your sprints and releases. I generally do both. I do my initial high-level estimate for my ROM. Then I do a backlog planning estimate. I might call it my full estimate or my backlog planning estimate. And then I start doing my release planning. And I very seldom do I break it down into sprints that anyone's going to see. When I'm working with a Scrum Master or with a software engineering manager, we take a look at what people are proposing for sprints and drop it in there and say, do we think it's going to fit? Or where do we have to fine tune? If they think it's going to fit, what are the parameters that have to be adjusted that are in reality related to what we can actually affect on the project itself? One example would be maybe we could really hold requirements volatility in. Maybe for this set of user stories, that's not going to change. Exactly what the story says is what we have to build, and we're comfortable with it, and the product owner's on board. All right, so maybe I can reduce requirements volatility, and now this thing fits for that sprint. Okay. So I mentioned before user stories and use cases. Now, user stories are the predominant Agile method used, but if you can describe it, you can scale it and put it in the SEER tool. So don't be thinking that just because you're doing Agile, or I should say just you're doing Scrum, as in some cases, that you have to be using user stories, you have to do a story point count. That's just how some people do it. And in fact, in a few minutes, I'll talk about that, but people are moving away from some of those areas. You can just as easily use function points or use case points or anything. All you have to do is be able to create a volume measure. Okay, the SEER is going to help you understand what your probable and likely velocity per sprint will be. So the nice thing about this is way up front, we have the ability to help people understand velocity, how much work can get done. And sometimes it gets a little tricky when you're trying to convert that back into story point velocity, et cetera, but it's very manageable. Okay, when people start to see that the tool's telling me how much work is likely to get done, they quickly gravitate towards the tool to understand or for that safety harness around their release planning. Okay, so as I mentioned, I build a high-level estimate, and generally I'll build it high. My high-level estimate, I'll see a typical waterfall. I go through, it'll come back and tell me about how many months that will be. I decide, well, how many people am I going to have on this project? In this example, I might be using a Scrum planning with a team of 4 people. So I start limiting my estimate around teams of 4, and next thing I know, it's coming back telling me exactly how many sprints I need if I'm doing 1-month sprints. If I'm doing 6-week sprints or 2-week sprints, this number just is a variable on that math. Okay, so nothing has changed. I still built a high-level estimate with whatever information I had. I still had to understand my size, through analogies or a list of features. So, but I was able to build an estimate with very little information. Okay. When you get ready to generate release estimates in the model, as I mentioned, you can go ahead and just start breaking them down, either at a release level or by sprints if you want to. And everything else is still done the same way. In this example, you can see that, we've fine-tuned this sprint. We're getting the work in within that one period of time. It's a 4-person team. We see that it's spilling over just a little bit, but it's enough within, we could probably go in and accommodate what we've now learned about this sprint. We don't have any luxury of of taking our time on this thing. We got to jump into it. Maybe we need to involve the product owner even more on this sprint because we're spilling over our 1 month sprint release period. Okay. So finishing up, what I want to do is I just want to kind of get on my soapbox a little bit. I literally travel all around the world, and I do training on story point counting. I help people, different companies do Agile project estimates. I was just in South Africa last month doing several webinars and presentations to them on how to build Agile estimates. And one of the things I run across all the time is typically these 4 items. And I'll explain them on the next slide, but my number one pet peeve is that Agile is not Scrum. Okay, and I'll talk about it in a moment. Scrum is really best for doing complex things, and that hybrid Scrum is not hybrid Agile, and avoiding estimates is the wrong thing to be doing. Okay, so let me just talk about each of these just briefly. Okay, here's a list of a bunch of different Agile methods. If you take a look at this list, which one are you doing? Most people, they say Agile, they say, oh, we're doing Scrum. Okay. And that may be the case, but what they do is they confuse Agile with Scrum. They think Scrum is Agile. Now, Scrum is a methodology that should be used for specific types of things that you're trying to do. Okay? So don't get into that mindset that Agile equals Scrum. Scrum is just one of many methods. Okay? Now, one of the things is people think that you should just use Scrum for everything. But if we go back and look at what Ken Schwab and Mike Beadle actually said about Scrum, they said it's for doing really complex things. But yet I go to different organizations where they're doing Scrum, daily stand-ups and Scrum for maintenance projects or maintenance activities where they have a requirements document in front of them that says you need to change the screen from red to blue, and there is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And they'll do a Scrum, and they get involved, and they put it on the burn down chart. They do a story point count on it. When that's the exact same thing we did 20 years ago, and we just called it a maintenance development activity. Okay, they didn't need to be doing Scrum. It was just a little waterfall activity they needed to do. Okay, that actually would have been a nice candidate for Kanban work, where you put it in the workload and you move forward. Okay, if they wanted that type of Agile approach, that's not to say that they should not use Agile methods, because they should still be doing the work with an Agile mindset. You know, you double check with that product owner if you're not sure, because they're the ultimate owner. You don't just make assumptions about things. But, you know, what shade of blue should that screen be? That's not your decision. It's the product owner's decision. So you can still keep the Agile mindset in mind, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to do a full-blown Scrum and assign a Scrum and have 4 people working on this and divvying it out. Okay? So keep this in mind next time people say they want to do Scrum just across the board for everything. You might want to go back to this reference and pull it out and have a good conversation with those people. Okay. Dan Gallerup in his blog several months ago had an article called World's Largest Agile Project Goes Back to Waterfall. And it was talking about this UK universal credit welfare system that just fell apart because they were trying to do Agile. Another one out of Computer Weekly was this DWP drops Agile for the flagship. I've gone into organizations where before I got there, my sponsor warned me, says, don't use the word Agile in here. If you say the word Agile, you'll be escorted out the door. And it's because they've had bad experiences using Agile projects. The reality is they probably really didn't have problems with Agile. They probably weren't really doing Agile. In the case of the UK welfare system, they're probably doing some invented hybrid Scrum. It was a huge project, and I imagine the technocrats and bureaucrats got their fingers into it, and they really weren't able to deliver it as a real Agile project. And that's just one of the things that may have been wrong. What they probably should have been doing is a hybrid Agile, not a hybrid Scrum. And hybrid Agile is a whole different thing from hybrid Scrum. Hybrid Agile, if some of the current industry practice around hybrid Agile are where you actually break Agile practices into these different layers: the technical skills, iteration management, products and projects, and portfolio governance. You break it down to these different layers, and then you take multiple methods that's appropriate for that layer and deploy that method. Okay? Especially, like it says, when one Agile method may be more appropriate than another. A good example of this is the Motley Fools, the portfolio management organization. They use a mix of Agile methodologies. They use Scrum and XP to exploit technical design issues and iterative releases for new systems. So they're using Scrum for complex things. Technical design issues. Where it gets hard, they Scrum. For enhancement of system maintenance, they use Kanban because it has a nice workflow to it that can be streamlined. Okay, so the question I ask everyone is, are you really Agile or are you just Scrum? And so many organizations I go into, they say, oh, we're doing Agile when they're not even doing anything close to Agile. Okay. Now, recently we had a lot of dialogue pop up in the blogs about no estimates. And I really can say that I don't blame people for wanting to move away from estimates because there's a lot of bad Agile estimates out there. Now, many slides ago, I gave you 2 full slides of why Agile estimates can be really bad. I think that is more an indicator of the problem than the fact that you don't need an estimate at all. Okay. But one of the top reasons why estimates are troubling is that story points and velocity. They're very powerful at root level management techniques, for managing your burn down, but they don't help you provide a business case analysis, verify your outsourced bids. They don't help you with risk analysis, or they don't allow you to create an outside view. An outside view is where you're taking a look at your problem from a different perspective rather than just your team or your product owner. Okay, you're letting historical data, for example, drive what the actual estimate should be. Okay, and I'm seeing a lot of organizations moving away from story points. Part of the problem is they're not very scalable and they're really only locally usable. Other organizations, they have a tremendous success with them because they know how to deal with them, and a lot of times they're just using the same teams over and over again, and if it's working for them, great. I am still a fan of story points because I think they allow you to remove personal biases away from the problem you're trying to solve and allow you to be a little more abstract in your thinking and come up with a scalar method of describing complexity. So I'm a huge story point fan, but not for doing estimates necessarily. Okay, I've seen a lot more success by teams that are adopting more task-centric sizing, like perfect days or hour blocks or function points. But even like perfect days, you have person biases that creep in and that affect them. Okay, so even other alternative methods are not always scalable. Okay, so to ask the question, are Agile estimates really needed? Well, the answer is yes. And the reality is it hasn't really changed much from what we've been doing for the last 35, 40 years. Okay, it just looks a little bit different, but it's not hard. And you really have to be agile in your thinking about how you're going to do your Agile estimates. Okay, so in kind of wrapping up here, I just want to reinforce a few points. That applying proven estimation methods to Agile projects brings greater clarity and understanding of the nuances introduced in an Agile project. Okay, so you need to have those estimates and you need to be able to have an understanding of what's going to happen to the project before it even starts. Okay. And what the model is going to do, it helps remove those ambiguities and those uncertainties. So when you know that certain things, or there's a good chance that certain things are going to happen or not, in the model you can actually embed the model with those uncertainties and come up with a lot better understanding of what your cost schedule, et cetera, is going to be. Okay, specifically around parametric cost estimating, it'll help you with your release planning. It gives you a good understanding of what kind of backlog you're going to have, the latent defects that you may be delivering, and also help you understand that, the ever-changing environmental factors. Your 2 of your best developers aren't available on the next sprint. What's the impact of that? Or your product owner just went on vacation for a month. What's the impact of that going to be? These are things you can actually put into a parametric model. Okay. Now, we provide a one-day hands-on workshop if you want to learn a lot more about how to build estimates and SEER for software for Agile. And as I mentioned, I travel all around the world doing story point training sessions as well. So all that's available to you if you want to inquire. So thank you for your attention today. And if you got any questions, you can contact us.